discussion dialogue. And once again, thank you for coming. Was it 2010? An ambassador, an American ambassador, who I think he left Nigeria like few years after then, wrote an essay, Nigeria, that's not good. So if you try to like read that book and think about where we are today, you might be asking, is he a man that saw yesterday or that saw tomorrow and decided to write that essay? Based on that essay and what Nigeria is currently facing, we at Next Year felt there is deep need to continue to discuss and then think out a way or think through how to make this the project Nigeria to work. Based on that, we spoke to a professor at Johns Hopkins University who is currently writing an essay, and he said he's happy to share his thoughts with us, and we thought, who are the best people to bring? Practitioners, academics, Nigerians who think we should find a way to solve these issues of security and violence which the country is going through at this moment. This evening we'll be having Professor Peter Lewis. Professor Peter Lewis is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. He has written extensively on Nigeria. And like we normally do, what we will do is to do a 25-minute presentation on this theme, theaters of war, violence and conflict in the Fourth Republic. So based on his presentation, we will now be, he will be moderated by Dr. Nkiokechukwu for another 25 minutes, and then it will be open up for the audience to make their contribution. And I know we are eager to move on, so I'm not going to take much of our time. I'll rather invite Professor Peter Lewis to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew Luis. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be with you this afternoon. As I have said to my colleagues and friends at Next Year, they keep me busy because I'm constantly seeing the dispatches on a daily basis, sometimes a twice daily basis, and they're deeply engaged in issues of conflict and violence here in Nigeria, and so we thought it would be. Yep. Usually I just bellow. Great. Thank you. And then do you have the slides? Oh, okay, there we go. So it's a great opportunity to be able to join you today. Sorry, just scroll down. I see. Okay, good. Yeah. So let me begin, and then hopefully we can get the pictures sorted out. The focus here is not to describe the conflicts that have occurred in Nigeria over the last 20 years, because these are well known to everyone in this room and well known to Nigerians. But in looking at the discussion, and particularly the scholarship, around the various forms of violence under the Fourth Republic, it's been striking that much of the discussion has been very descriptive, and there hasn't really been a clear, encompassing explanation for why we're seeing violence in certain areas but not other areas, why we're seeing violence take certain forms but not others, why we're seeing the trends that we are. And so this is a first attempt to provide a comprehensive or encompassing explanation for patterns of violence under the Fourth Republic. And the problem is well known, and it's framed as an issue of democracy and inclusion. We've had a 1999 transition to the Fourth Republic after decades, a long history of military rule, civilian and military cycles. Since that time, we've seen 6 election cycles, which is an unprecedented era of electoral rule in Nigeria. And there was a peaceful transition or a peaceful turnover of power in 2015. And a large and diverse federal electoral regime has presided over Nigeria for 2 decades. This is the longest period of electoral rule in Nigeria's post-independence history. And many people see federalism, elections, democratic rights as mechanisms of conflict resolution, mechanisms that give people representation and enable conflict management. But that's not the pattern that we've seen in Nigeria. Given Nigeria's basic attributes, we can think about Nigeria in comparison to countries such as South Africa, India, Mexico, Indonesia, which are also large federal electoral systems. And many of these countries have seen episodes of violence which have been mitigated over time. But in Nigeria, we're seeing a spread of violence and escalation of violence. So that's the fundamental problem and the distinction that we're witnessing here that we need some explanation. The focus of this project is collective violence. We're less concerned about individual level criminal violence, although that's obviously a deep and serious concern across the country. But we're interested in violence across groups, targeting people for group identity, mobilizing people along group identity. So we're talking about the insurgencies, militia activity, vigilantes, rioters, and so forth. Since the transition to the Fourth Republic, at least 70,000 people have died in collective violence. There have been more than 4,000 incidents nationally. And it's pervasive and it's worsening. And this is really in contrast to what we saw in South Africa, where there was a lot of violence at the transition and then it rapidly dropped off. Or Indonesia, where there was a lot of violence in the wake of the transition and then it diminished in a reasonable amount of time. Or in India, where there are regular ethnic riots and regular electoral violence, but it's maintained at fairly low levels. So Nigeria emerges as what we can call a violent democracy. There are some institutions of constitutional electoral rule, many of which are durable. There are democratic rights and freedoms in many parts of the country and in many segments of society, but there's also endemic violence which accompanies that. And this is a problematic form of democracy. If we look at some of the magnitudes and the figures, and I'll elaborate on where these come from in a few minutes, the Boko Haram insurgency, the orange lines are the number of casualties, the blue lines are the number of incidents. The Boko Haram insurgency, no surprise, dwarfs everything else with more than 25,000 deaths. In fact, these numbers go up to the end of 2016. If we were to update them, which we are doing now, this would exceed 30,000. The Niger Delta insurgency, conflicts among herders and farmers, which is more than 6,000, and political, electoral violence. So the key questions from this scenario that I'm painting are: why has violence worsened under Nigeria's Fourth Republic? What accounts for variations across the country and over time? How do we understand the changing patterns of violence? What are the key drivers of collective violence across the country? And does this analysis give us any tools or any ideas about mitigating or resolving violent conflict? Sorry about the advancement here. So we need better analysis. And I am offering a gentle criticism of both international and domestic analysts, because I think that we have not brought to bear the considerable tools that we have for understanding violent conflict in a comparative perspective in thinking about Nigeria. Most of the existing accounts that we have, some of which are quite detailed and incisive, are descriptive. They focus on scope and variety. The central insight is that there are many different kinds of violence occurring here. It's not one fault line, it's not one group, it's not one source of identity or grievance. And so people talk about Boko Haram, they talk about the Niger Delta, they talk about herders and farmers, they discuss electoral violence, and so there are many different forms, but nobody has really tried to make sense of analytically how they may have some broad similarities. There are also generic explanations. In almost every analysis of violence that we see on Nigeria, people talk about poverty and poor governance and ethnic identity. Yes, all of those factors are important. There is no question about it. Those are important drivers of conflict. But these factors exist across the space, across the country. There are very few areas that don't experience the consequences of poor governance or ethnic identity or poverty. And yet there is not violence everywhere. And so generic explanations need to be refined. There are different levels of analysis. People talk about background factors, histories of conflict, or demography, or they talk about mid-range factors such as politicians' strategies and the support for militias, or political violence encouraged by parties, or they talk about micro-level factors, how people perceive their identities. And they haven't really sorted those out. So we need to better understand where conflict is occurring, when, and whether there are common conditions. So I'm offering what I hope is a first cut and what I hope will be useful in this conversation by looking at three key explanatory factors. And I think these factors explain when and where we see violence across Nigeria's territory and under conditions of an emerging or imperfect and violent democracy. One factor is relative group exclusion. Which groups perceive special deficits in political representation and in distribution in terms of economic outcomes and access to resources. The second factor is elite authority. How unified or cohesive are elites among different segments of the country? How well do they bargain within central politics? How effectively? And how much authority can they and leverage can they wield within their communities? So bargaining and cohesion are critical elements. And the third element is state violence. Because if we look at some of the critical conflicts in Nigeria, we see that state violence, when applied in certain indiscriminate or provocative ways, can actually worsen conflict. And that has been a tipping point in certain conflicts, and it's been problematic. So the basic framework says where you have groups that perceive a particular form of exclusion, where there is elite breakdown, and particularly when youth become mobilized and youth activism and militancy becomes a problem, and where there is provocative state violence, those are the areas where you're likely to see chronic and escalating conflict. And so it helps to, this is a framework which helps to account for the time and place of conflict, as well as the common features of diverse strife. And the argument here is that the common explanations that we have for conflict are inadequate for understanding these factors. General governance problems are certainly a factor in conflict, but if we look at the Northwest versus the Northeast, both areas are poorly governed, but there's violence in the Northeast and not in the same degree as the Northwest. If we look at relative poverty, There's an insurgency in the South-South, which is simply not as impoverished as in the Northeast. Or narratives of grievance. If everybody who had a narrative of grievance and said they were marginalized was engaged in violent conflict, every group in the country would be engaged in violent conflict. So it's not just marginalization or that narrative. Neither is it access to resources. Boko Haram is in an area where there are very few resources to exploit for encouraging conflict, compared with MEN or the Avengers in the Niger Delta, where there are a lot of resources. And them present in every conflict, but they're not sufficient for us to understand the patterns. So if we look where the conflicts are in the country, this is the distribution of violence. Over the last approximately 20 years, we see the Middle Belt and Kaduna. So you have Plateau, Kaduna, Benue. You have obviously the Northeast, and then pockets in the Niger Delta and some other areas. But there's a clear concentration, but that map does not match up with this map. This is one of the less impoverished areas in the country. This is the most impoverished area in the country. They both have insurgencies. This area, Kaduna and Plateau and Benue, have varying levels of poverty and public goods, and yet they also have a lot of violence. So where and when does large-scale violence occur? They're linked, these areas of violence are linked to political exclusion in a weakly institutionalized democracy. Power sharing, the argument here is that power sharing, zoning, and other forms of power sharing, and bargains over distribution should have the potential to forge a durable settlement and create a sense of general national inclusion. But unstable bargains and exclusionary settlements, which is what we see as the dispensation under the Fourth Republic, are susceptible to violence. And this is the core problem that I'm calling attention to, or underscoring, if you will. It's not an original insight. Other people have talked about this in many different capacities, but it's the element that I think we should underscore in trying to understand what is happening in Nigeria now. That you have a bargain among the political class around sharing power and sharing petroleum rents and the rents that come mediated through the state. And that bargain is sufficient to maintain electoral rule through multiple cycles and maintain a certain type of party politics. But many segments of the country are being left out of that bargain. And what you're seeing as a result is violence, which is being fomented and escalating in many parts of the country. So the groups that perceive exclusion from political and economic access are likely to engage in collective violence, especially in areas where elites have limited authority over their zones and where elites cannot provide either distribution or some kind of political authority in order to tamp down violence. And there are shifts over time linked to electoral cycles and state security forces. So I think I can skip through this very quickly because time is of the essence, and I'll simply say, and these are well known to this audience, and simply to point out that for the first 30 years of Nigerian independence, from 1960 to 1990, or really for 40 years really, from 1959 to 1999, we had an unstable sequence of settlements among democratic governments. You had a federal parliamentary system at independence, which shared power among parties that were led by the so-called dominant minorities, the three largest minorities in the country, and other groups were subsumed in the regions. And then after that system broke down, both the democratic system and the country experienced a devastating civil war, the post-war settlement after 1970 was built on trying to keep the country stable and united through federalism, through revenue allocation, through distributing petroleum rents, and through competitive clientelism. So there were formal and informal mechanisms. It didn't work in the Second Republic. That government too fell to invidious competition. But after 15 years of military rule, the Fourth Republic was established. And that has been organized on a fairly durable power sharing bargain, zoning among the regions, which has been shaky, but has been a principle that many segments of the elite have sought to follow. But there have been flawed elections, there's been uneven access to power among regions, there's been exclusion from the core party settlement, both between parties and within parties, and we've seen worsening violence in election cycles. So to apply the framework and to simply summarize what the argument is in looking at this history, Nigeria has been structured around bargains of rent distribution negotiated by an elite cartel. It's been stable since 1999 at the center, but highly volatile at the margins. And exclusion, the groups that are excluded from the distributed bargain through flawed elections and oligarchic parties are the groups that have tended to support and sustain or mobilize in violent contention. And so what we see is that violence is emerging in Nigeria among secondary minorities, not among the dominant minorities who forged the bargain of 1959, if you will, but secondary minorities in the Niger Delta, in the Northeast, in the Middle Belt. And the fragmentation of those elites and the mobilization of youth tend to drive the conflict in the near term, and state violence has incited core conflicts and insurgencies. So I'm going to skip over this and simply say that we've got a project that is really sort of essential core of this study, which is to map violence in the Fourth Republic. And so we've been able to compile a data set of every violent incident in which there's been at least one fatality. And this ranges everything from a small feud or dispute in a village where one person is killed to riots in Kaduna or large battles in the Northeast where thousands of people are killed. So anything that has been reported in domestic media in Nigeria or international media or through human rights organizations or NGOs that has been effectively documented is included in this data set. We have the dates and we have the duration and the location, who the antagonists are, and what the casualty rates are. And the key patterns that emerge from this are twofold, actually threefold. One is that violence is highly concentrated in Nigeria. There are 4 different complexes of conflict which account for 85% of the fatalities over the last 20 years. Boko Haram is no surprise to anybody. The violence in Plateau, Kaduna, Benue is ethno-religious and land-based. There have been 15,000 fatalities there. The Niger Delta insurgency has cost about 5,000 lives. And electoral violence, herders and farmers, which is growing, is at least 6,000. And these may be underestimates, and we can discuss that in the Q&A, but these are what we've been able to effectively document through actual reports. And then there's electoral violence, which has been at least 2,500 over the last 20 years through different cycles. The point about these different conflicts is how diverse they are. You can't point to a single driver or a single identity or a single fault line in looking at the the four complexes of conflict. There's not an ethnic group, a religion, and a regional division or a partisan division that explains the violence. It's very diverse across the different conflicts. The other thing that comes out of the events analysis is that violence is cyclical in Nigeria. It's not only concentrated, but it tends to follow election cycles. If we see the Niger Delta, we see high points or escalation in 1999 and then again in 2003. Boko Haram, beginning in 2003 really, but then really escalating after 2011. The Middle Belt escalating or more intense at almost every juncture, certainly 99, 2003, 2007, and 2011. And that's partially because identities become more acute and because politicians facilitate militias. Oh, for a clicker. There we go. So here's just a graphic that shows the patterns, and you can see here, people can't necessarily read this, the orange field is Boko Haram, the blue field is political and electoral violence, the yellow band is the Niger Delta insurgency, and the herder-farmer conflict is in gray. And the dotted line are cumulative fatalities over time. And so obviously, we have this tipping point in 2011 where everything just takes off with Boko Haram. And then we see also the escalation of herder-farmer conflict, where we can see the Niger Delta here and the formation of Dakubo Asari's organization and then MEN. And then we can see periodic electoral violence and then the escalation of the northeastern insurgency. And similarly, we can see the shifting terrain of conflict in Nigeria. This is the first period from 1999 to 2008, where violence is strongly concentrated in the Middle Belt and Kano, and in the Niger Delta, and there's virtually nothing, there's very little in the Northeast. And then we move to the more recent period, 2009 to 2016, which is slightly out of date by 2 years, but there's enormous amounts of violence in the Northeast and real hot spots in this band from Benue through Plateau through Kaduna and now up into Zamfara and Katsina. So what do the patterns tell us? One important factor, which I think is one of the most significant aspects of the study, is that violence is happening at what we can call the near margins. That is to say, groups, secondary groups that are outside of the core bargain of 1959. So if we think about House of Fulani elites and parties, if we think about Yoruba elites and parties, and Igbo elites and parties, and how those three groups set up a certain competitive dynamic in 1960, in 1979, and then again in 1999, those are the core groups that are essential to the bargain. And the secondary groups that are not quite integrated in that bargain are where we're seeing a lot of violence. Ijaw, Kanuri, non-elite Fulani, Tiv, Birom, Christian and Muslim minorities. For the most part, and I want to be very clear about the argument is not that these groups are ethno-nationalist groups that are mobilizing for some type of provocative rebellion. But they are groups that perceive themselves to be marginalized, and that means that segments of those communities, especially youth who face very few prospects, can be mobilized. And there are segments of the political class or the elites who are willing to use ethnicity and even to mobilize violent militias and ethnic violence as a way of securing political leverage. And so these dynamics are reinforced by political exclusion, and these are evidence in the hubs of collective violence. Also, when we look at individual conflicts, we see that it's clearly associated with elite fragmentation and youth defection. There have been important writings by Michael Watts and Safir Jawad Peterside on the Niger Delta, who talk about the breakdown in chieftaincy, chiefly authority, and the rise of youth militancy. Jibo Ibrahim has written perceptively about youth rebellions in the north and the breakdown in the legitimacy of political elites there. And then we also see how attacks on Mohammed Yusuf in 2009 and the killing of the Ogoni 9 in 1995 really played roles as a tipping point in terms of escalating those conflicts. So state violence can be an important role. So here's my concluding point, and my discussant and colleague will be happy that we're winding up. Hopefully in time, I think so. What are the implications of this analysis? The analysis covers 2 decades of contentious politics under one electoral regime, the Fourth Republic. And it provides or offers a framework for understanding diverse forms of violence and for understanding the location of violence and its unfolding over time. And it says that there are a constellation or a convergence of circumstances which tend to provide the basis for violent mobilization in certain areas among certain groups and tend to escalate violence over time. One is where you have particular forms of political and economic exclusion. Secondly, it's where local elites cannot provide sufficient leverage or authority to maintain stability, or in which fragmented elites actually aggravate mobilization and identity. And the third element is where you have a provocative role of state security response, which can tend to aggravate conflict. So there are some prescriptions that arise from the analysis. It's not merely an academic exercise. If we can identify with greater clarity where violence is happening and why it's happening, then we can perhaps understand better how to approach or manage the drivers of conflict in a way that we can mitigate conflict. So one element is party inclusion. If there's a greater incorporation of elites, more internal competition, less party oligarchy, more expansive and inclusive parties, as we've seen in countries such as Tanzania or even Ghana, then it's possible that we can have a less violent, competitive electoral process. The second obvious point here does speak to governance, and that is the importance of public goods and social safety nets. In South Africa, in Indonesia, in India, economic growth, income supports, social safety nets, efforts to address inequality have clearly been associated with diminishing violence. So reducing the tensions over distribution and the economic side of exclusion is quite critical. Restructuring is an issue that's very much in the public eye right now, and I think that it's clearly critical, and that comes out of this analysis. It's underscored by this analysis as well. You have to have devolution, you have to have true federalism, you have to have decentralization, so that different segments of the country feel that their access to the center is not a do-or-die factor that affects their own fortunes, that they have some prospects within their own regions and among their own groups. And the importance of elite narratives and the problem of inciting ethnic polarization and reforming the security sector. So I think all of these elements, which are not huge surprises to this audience, but I think are, again, powerfully underscored in terms of where we need to place our efforts, where we need to place our emphasis, what kinds of levers we want to focus on if we're going to try to diminish or mitigate violence over the medium to longer term. And with that, I'll wind up and thank you. And I look forward to a good conversation.
Another round of applause for Professor Luke. So we are going to move into the moderated section, and I'll be inviting Dr. Ikechukwu, MNI. Dr. Ikechukwu is a distinguished member of National Institute of Policy and Strategic Studies. He has a doctorate in philosophy. He has worked variously with a lot of government in Nigeria. He's a senior fellow at Nanda Azikiwe University. And so many more. The profile is just so much. I'm not going to keep reading them. I'm not eager to get into this section. So, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And welcome to what I hope will be a very interesting discussion. But to get us all up to speed, I want to draw attention to a few of the highlights so that in our interventions we know the essential points the speaker has made. This is a war. It's in writing, and the major focus is he focused on patterns of collective violence under democratic rule, the complex patterns of violence across Nigeria, how the Nigerian experience can yield a template for valid inferences within Africa and across Africa. And that's an area I hope you will want to raise questions, because our experience here have similar patterns than elsewhere from which a template can be developed. And the following questions were raised by him. Why has democracy been accompanied by polarization, violence, and an increasingly violent political landscape in Nigeria? Why have mechanisms for political incorporation, including reforms, failed to resolve matters of equity and ethnic issues? Why are intensive conflicts concentrated in some areas with very different social and economic attributes? As you noted, you have conflict in the northeast, where there's poverty and poor governance. You have conflict in the south-south, where there's a lot of wealth. So the fact of the economic condition of the situation, as can be drawn from the war, is not just a question of per capita income, but other factors which I hope will arise in the questions to come. Then, of course, among other things, he developed a framework. He broadly frames patterns of collective violence as a problem of incorporation under an electoral regime as follows. Failure of the promise of broader representation. In other words, in some places you have conflict because after the election, people cannot quite see what it is they've gotten out of the polity. Intergroup and intra-group and anti-state violence leading to large insurgencies fueled by discontent. How the experience of Nigeria enables a comparison and all of that. So our task here is quite simple because it breaks it down into three factors: political exclusion, elite use and misuse of leadership and authority, and state violence. And these are the three factors fueling violence here. And our task now is threefold: to interrogate issues he has raised, to draw relevant inferences from the examples he has given, to make extrapolations towards a more universal template for understanding conflicts of this nature. Now, I'll flag up by asking you a few questions, then it will be open to the floor. Well, Prof, how much of the current level of violence and conflict in Nigeria is due to the failure of preemptive intelligence work from your work?
The failure of?
Preemptive intelligence.
Oh.
Yeah. How much of the conflict can you trace to that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Flip this one. Good. Okay. Preemptive intelligence work. Well, I think quite a bit. I think most, if we look at how government has approached most of the major conflicts that we've seen, I think it would be difficult to conclude other than that it has been reactive. It has not been proactive. The government was surprised by the intensity of the Boko Haram insurgency and the way it unfolded and spiraled. It began to, after 3 years of very intensive insurgency and control of most of Borno State, much of Yobe State, and segments of Adamawa State, it began to get some control in 2014 and early 2015 with the Joint Task Force. And now it's growing again. If we look at the Jos riots of 2001, the Kaduna riots of 2000, the Lagos disturbances of 1999 and 2000, Aba, Shagamu, it would be difficult to conclude other than that this was a reaction. Nobody foresaw it coming. And in the Niger Delta, again, my analysis, my interpretation, and I'm reading the wisdom and scholarship of activists and scholars from the region, is that it was evident certainly from the death of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the new local government creation under Abacha and the violence that unleashed, that there was a problem that was brewing in the Delta and needed some mitigation. So I think that the government has had either poor intelligence or it's had
inattentive to the intelligence
good
reports.
intelligence and it's been inattentive.
Thank you very much. Another, would you say that from your research, would you say that there are cultural factors that predispose nations, particularly African nation states created from colonialism, to the kind of violence you see?
Well, there's a
Because the point is that these states, the nation states of Africa, did not emerge as a result of cultural experience and integration. You locate some cultural factors.
Of course, there's no question that there is a long historical lineage, and even within these conflicts, you'll see lineages that predate colonialism in some cases, Ife Modakeke, and in Kingdom Bornu and so forth. But certainly the artificial external imposition and creation of boundaries of African states created a situation where groups were put together or subdivided and where they were pushed into competition. So there's no question that as a general condition that's a problem. However, we see variations across Africa. Every African country, except for Somalia, had the situation of being a multi-ethnic country under colonial borders. And even Somalia was under colonial borders too, although it was more ethnically unified. Somalia has been quite violent. Sudan has been quite violent. Nigeria has had problems. And we could go on, Congo and so forth. But Malawi, Tanzania, Ghana have been less so. And so it's an enabling condition, but it's not a universal determinant.
Well, as you notice, the conflict is asymmetrical.
Yes.
It's not like a war where there's a target you go to shoot, right? And so the research has thrown up for you the positive factors, shifting from one place to another. I don't know if you have any thoughts on containment strategies. That is, the war is asymmetrical. How do you take it on? How would you, for instance, urge a state under the kind of situation we are to deal with this?
Well, that's a critical question, and of course we're dealing with different kinds of violence. So in the Niger Delta and the Northeast, we have organized insurgency. So there are insurgent groups, they're using terrorist tactics or they're using insurgent tactics. MEND and the Avengers and other groups are more interested in property and economic targets, so you don't find the same levels of fatalities and casualties. In Boko Haram and ISWAP, we see obviously they're targeting people. How do you get control of it? You properly resource your military and your police. You properly train them to do professional types of policing and counterinsurgency. You try to marshal as best you can both your kinetic resources, your weaponry and materiel, and your intelligence resources. And in other countries, including Indonesia or Sri Lanka and Colombia and so forth, these have been the key approaches.
With clear results, actually.
Yes.
Well, in your opening remarks, you said that the studies so far have been mostly descriptive. All right, there are positions, of course, but I want you to look at something specific. Insurgency and violence does a lot of things.
Yes.
Human capital development suffers. Collapse of local economies follow with it. Environmental degradation occurs. Like if you take the northeast, which is in the desert, with the movement of the people out of the place for more than a year, desertification has occurred. And so even if you want to resettle, then there's no land to resettle in this part of the desert. Water pollution, among all these issues. You will note that the analysis as presented in the study focuses on issues of, if you like, politics and policy.
Yes.
Elements of environment, the political economy of the crisis. Perhaps you want to comment on that before we go to the others.
That is the emphasis that I am offering, and that's what I'm focusing on. Your question raises the excellent and important point about these other factors and other types of analysis. And in fact, the situation that we encountered in Maiduguri in 2009 is of an order of magnitude of difference. It's another world of what we confront today, with 2.5 million internally displaced people, 4 million people with at risk of hunger and starvation, in need of food aid, the displacement and so forth. And degradation of farming, of human capital, of livelihoods and so forth. And so in addressing conflict mitigation and trying to think about what the government could do in mitigating conflict in the Northeast, it would be not just, obviously, military operations against the insurgents, which is part of the picture, but also addressing the wider social, economic, and even cultural dislocation that has occurred. And those are universals in terms of conflict management around the world, and they're essential to be cognizant of here.
Thank you very much. Let's say to him, ladies and gentlemen.
Two quick points, at least. The first is to understand what exactly is being explained. Is it the conflict or the spike that has happened since about 2011? 2011. Is it the spike that we have to explain, or the conflict? Because I think this is very important, because if you look at some of the conflicts you spoke about, actually a number of them appear to predate the electoral, they do. So perhaps what it is to explain the spike.
Yeah.
And I think I completely agree with you about the importance of elite pacts in understanding whether you have a spike in conflict. But I think really what needs to be explained is the spike. I think those structural issues that, explaining those conflicts are important. But I think, we also need to understand. Sorry. Oh, okay. So that's the first point. I think they predate the period. While I agree with the elite pact, but I think also we need to understand the specific histories of each of these conflicts.
Yes.
I think it's extremely important. The last point for me is also, look, if you look at the history of Nigeria, as you have talked about, I think stability has been ensured by essentially two factors. One has been military rule in itself, even if it's the piece of the graveyard, and secondly, elite pacts. One is completely outdated now, I hope. The other one is intrinsically unstable, elite pacts. And I think we need to understand why elite pacts are prone to collapse. I think that would be an interesting addition to this. And I'm also surprised that you didn't talk about for instance, the Biafran insurgency, where you have also had a number of deaths.
Yeah.
And in my own right, and I've also tried to explain this, while understanding the history, to understand the spike as also connected to these questions of elite pact. I think it's important as well to bring in some of these issues.
Thank you.
I have chapters on all the different conflicts. Every single conflict obviously has a history and a genesis. We can go back 1,000 years in terms of rural banditry, the instability and conflict around the Lake Chad region, groups and dissident groups in Kenya and Borno, and we can go back 200 years within the Caliphate to find pockets of violence. We can go back to Ijaw, Urhobo, Itchikiri conflicts. You're quite right that the military has a certain kind of authoritarian control. And that's why every time you have a transition, you get violence. South Africa, Russia, Indonesia, the list goes on. But in all of those transitions, Russia was electoral democratic for a brief period, but in all of those transitions, violence spiked after the transition and then went down. It was contained because of elite pacts and because of the enforcement capabilities of the government. So those two factors worked in tandem to tamp things down. And that hasn't operated here. I'm interested in the spike, and the spike is clearly driven by Boko Haram and an overstretched, overextended security sector, which, given the upsurge now in herder-farmer violence and in banditry and so forth, is now almost at the tipping point or the breaking point, unable to manage conflict and violence within the territory. It's a Hobbesian kind of situation, and it's extremely alarming. But I do think that even given the different magnitude of Boko Haram, we see the same dynamics in the Middle Belt, and we see the same pattern in the Niger Delta, even though the casualties were less and they were more episodic. So I agree with you that we need to look at historical foundations and antecedents, and that's in the case chapters that I have in the book. And I certainly agree that we need to explain both the incidents of violence and the sudden spike. And that spike is what's unique about Nigeria.
Thank you very much.
Very quick. My name is Aisha Umar. I'm a lawyer, and I've been doing a lot of humanitarian work in Borno State, which is my state. And I just wanted to say two things, or ask you two questions. One is to do with the issue of negotiations. I know that there was a few years ago, the former president, Obasanjo, went to Borno and tried to reach out to the Boko Haram sect at the beginning. I think it was about 2009, 2010. But he met with one or two of them at the time when things had escalated, and they complained about the violations, the massacre that took place around the time that Mohammed Yusuf was killed. The soldiers were sent in at the time. It was used to be just a police affair. And then the late Yar'Adua, the president, sent army to massacre the Boko Haram based on our governor, Ali Sharif's instructions. He gave him the impression that they were anti-government and all sorts of stuff. So he sent army. They went and they massacred. They went door to door. And every young man between the age of 12 to maybe 30, they just shot them on sight. And sometimes they were just driving around town, and when they saw a group of people, they would just go and shoot them, kill them. There were videos on Al Jazeera on that. So that has not been addressed, and I think that negotiation, maybe it's too late now, things have escalated now, many years have passed, and so much has happened. But is that a possibility in your opinion? The second thing is to do with this conspiracy theory. I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory, but right now in Borno, the people believe that the funding is coming from the West, and the reason being that the kind of arms and sophisticated arms that these insurgents have, we know that they could never possibly have been able to raise the kind of money that they have to, And then there comes in the forest, you see very sophisticated communications equipment, etc. And then we have the aid agencies flying in, and I see them often. They fly in with their jets from also all different countries. They go into Sambisa for weeks. These are the aid agencies. They come out unscathed. Not one attack ever. But yet, when our own Nigerian military go, they just, attack them. All sorts of things. Honestly, we don't understand. But there's something, you did mention these external forces as well. Thank you. Sorry I took time.
One of the central points in the argument, with the example of 2009 in Maiduguri and other cities. That was indiscriminate state violence. And that escalating situation, it started out with a dispute about motorcycle helmets. There were some deaths. And then the attack in July of 2009 really sparked everything. And that is the critical juncture. And so the argument here is that indiscriminate and provocative state violence serves to escalate and radicalize groups that might otherwise be open to negotiation or some kind of mitigation. And clearly this is operated, and it wasn't just 2009, it continued in terms of human rights abuses and people disappearing into the barracks and so on and so forth. And this is not to say that there are not terrorist elements of the insurgency operating and committing gross brutalities against civilians, against Muslims, against Christians, against security forces. There is a ruthless insurgency, and part of the solution can only be a military solution. But the difference between a carefully disciplined military counterforce and an indiscriminate attack, which tends to simply create an escalating spiral, is a big difference. You ask about negotiations. There are some elements of both ISWAP and Boko Haram there is no possibility of negotiations. It's going to be a battlefield settlement. We know for a fact that there are some elements who are occasional, circumstantial participants. And if an amnesty or a negotiation could peel off elements so that you're dealing with a much smaller hardcore group, isn't that preferable? Or would you rather be fighting more people who are angry because of the abuses and angry and energized because of the instability? And so, and the other question about I can't comment on the conspiracy theories. I don't think there's any evidence for it, but I do think that there is a good deal of evidence about how insurgencies get resources and about how this insurgency is getting weapons. And I think the critical explanation is not only transfers from the Nigerian military, which may be happening, and we've seen documentation about that, but also the collapse of Gaddafi's government in Libya and the huge trans-Saharan weapons network that was unleashed. Because remember, Niger Delta got their weapons along the coast. They came from Sierra Leone and Liberian civil wars, and they could move there up the creeks along the coast. That was the circuit of small arms and light weapons and other material that fueled the militants in the Delta. But Boko Haram didn't have that connection. They couldn't go from the coast up to Borno, but they can go across the Sahel. And so that's critical.
Thank you. We'll try to speed it up. We'll take 5 questions. You will answer them. Then we'll move on again. That way it will be faster.
Very good.
A former theater commander in this one, Boko Haram in business. Ahuma will introduce later. So let's, while we're talking, let's know that some of those who have taken non-live bullets are in this room with us. Sir.
Mine is more of a comment, because I see
But usually, please, let's introduce ourselves, the organization we represent, and then conscious of the time, please.
Okay, I stand up. I think mine is more of a comment, because I see you are interested in the solution to what we're going through as a country, and whenever you see somebody working hard to move our country forward, it would be nice to interact with them and exchange ideas with them. I noticed that you've done some research on the kind of violence that we confront here. Like you know, violence is a product of dysfunctional systems. Every violence, at the back of it, there's some dysfunctionality in the relationship that exists in that environment. So solving the dysfunctionality would be the basic way to approach how to remove the violence. You also pointed, correctly I would add, to the fact that the elite phenomenon has a central role to play going forward. My comment here is not to oversimplify what we call the elite phenomenon in Nigeria, and also not to transport elite concepts from other jurisdictions to the Nigerian jurisdiction. Because the elite definition, as we understand it, typically emerges from the evolution of the nation and the activities that the nation takes part in. So you see elite evolution from either from the industrial, the military, the public service, and the commercial complexes produces the elite. Now, if you have a situation where those components of the complex that produce elites are in themselves very weak, you begin to imagine what kind of elites are produced from that engineering process. Now, if you understand that and you want to change our process, it's better to invest in redefining what kind of elites that we should have, rather than you expecting magic from the elites that we have.
Thank you very much. Number 2.
My name is Vicky Shonda. I'm a humanitarian and a human rights activist. So my question is just one, and it's based on the growing, or rather certain internal patterns or trends in the conflict in Nigeria that we have seen that I have not seen in your work. Now we are looking at, so I did a recent study and some of these patterns came out in my study. First, the changing intentions and purposes of some of these fighting groups. We look at the Biafra war, you know, how there was need for cessation. We look at the Boko Haram insurgency and the need for control, and then that is backed by the religious angle to it. You look at the changing methodology and the continuous disregard for international humanitarian law. You look at patterns, and you look at actors and parties, you look at the gender aspect of it. But most importantly, you look at the commercialization of the war and how this actually contributes significantly to the continuation and expansion of the war, but most importantly serving as examples to other conflicts that we are seeing. We've seen how, for instance, certain people believe that when you adopt and you get money, then it serves as an example for such kind of war to continue. How do you premise these internal trends or patterns, you know, in your own work, but most importantly in finding lasting solutions to the issues that we are talking about?
Thank you very much.
I'm a conflict transformation expert based in Abuja. My questions are just 2 comments. The first is early warning and early response. All the signs of conflict are always there. So the signs of early warning are all over. Maybe it's the aggregation of all these diverse warning signs that are not well articulated. But the major problem is the early response. I'll stop at that for that. And secondly, in the last 3 years, there has been a delicate convergence or intersection between different kinds of conflict: rural banditry, Boko Haram, criminality, kidnapping. They sort of occur pari passu. And this calls for urgent renegotiation among the peoples and the elite consensus, and also intervention. What are your views on this? Thank you.
Okay, just before number 4 comes in the seat. If you look at the beggar population in Nigeria, particularly in the north, they fall between the ages of 3 and 14. If you look at the armed robbery, kidnap, sundry crimes population, they fall between 16 and 38, 40. That means that these are Nigerian youths born within the years of democracy but not capacitated. That element should be taken into account so that a tendency to limit the narrative to either the current government or the one before it is an elite failure we must acknowledge and ignore the masquerade called parties with which the elite have been playing against us. Number 4.
Special interest in small arms and light weapons.
Now that should get us worried. You're interested in arms?
Small arms and light weapons.
Can I leave the room? Sorry, go on.
Thank you. And the armed conflicts that come with them. Mine is just to draw your attention to what I saw on your presentation, particularly how it has to do with migration of the conflict from the coastline going far into the deserts. I want to draw your attention to the fact that it would be nice if you consider the impact of political exclusion, which frustrates preemptive intelligence and all the efforts the government is making to track violence. Without going into the meaning and the arguments that go around who is a terrorist and the rest of them, if you realize that there's a disconnect between the government and the people, which has grown from strength to strength in the last 20 years, that will explain to you why one conflict seems to be dying out, the other is coming on. One example I want to draw your attention to is that a few years ago, a young man who came to the Okuta panel as a young lawyer was elected into the Federal House. And after a few years, I heard him say it was cheaper for him to fly a private jet from Abuja to Maiduguri than to go by road. How do you think the people in his constituency will receive him? And how does that affect the trajectory of conflict? Thank you.
Bashir Melu, I'm a solicitor. I'm also from Borno. I essentially want to talk about the Boko Haram and the use of state violence to stifle a group, which actually was the result of the, what Boko Haram is now. As we know, the origin to that, it's a commentary, the origin to that insurgency was a little misunderstanding, a very little misunderstanding, and the execution of people by the state and the leadership of those people. If the state had taken time to negotiate with the leadership, it would have Boko Haram by now, but it's still as it is. Well, what is happening right now in the Northwest, the Shia issue, is similar to Boko Haram. And I think with the powers that we here, let us also note that that is a potential tight bomb, and we should be able to take care of it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out the way you should. Particularly also the efforts of the people on the ground. And I hope that conversation should be taken up with the NEDC, and then probably Prof might want to look into that. There is a totally different narrative on that. So will you respond to that? Keeping to time, like I told you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Or probably on earth today, this is the most resourceful. Please clap for yourself. So that you please take on this, we take another.
The caliber of the conversation. So let me take these questions or pieces of them. Some of them were comments, and I can do it fairly quickly. I agree with the first commentator that there is a fundamental dysfunction in the system and a fundamental problem of the way elites have crafted their paths. I think that other countries have confronted these kinds of junctures, and I don't think that simply because we find ourselves in a difficult and even intractable situation today that it means there's no path forward. But I do agree that right now, given the level of insecurity, the level of violence, and clearly the incentives and the strategies of the political class, that we're in a kind of cul-de-sac at the moment. And thinking about how to break forward either through a realignment of parties, through new leadership, through new coalitions coming from civil society and intersecting or interacting with political elites. That's a question for Nigerians, and it's a question that many countries have had to confront. The second question, which I want to fasten on from the woman who's engaged in human rights and humanitarian efforts, is you hit upon a critical element. The political economy of conflict is absolutely essential. And it's not exclusive to Nigeria. I was talking to some people the other day about how it plays out in Latin America. What happens in all of these situations is that once a conflict begins to escalate, security forces, local actors, landowners, elites, what have you, all find ways of profiting. Insurgents. And so if there are bank robberies, if there are kidnappings, if there are oil bunkering, if there are attacks on property, what have you, taxing the trade, or rather fisheries trade around Lake Chad and so forth, that money goes to fuel the insurgency. Some of the political elites who want to insulate themselves from attacks may pay the insurgents. There can be economic incentives, even for some of the security forces. We know that there have been mutinies in certain garrisons in Nigeria where rank and file soldiers said that they weren't getting paid. They were going into battle without bullets. We know that there was a huge case with a previous Minister of Defense who was accused of siphoning billions of dollars, more than $2 billion, from the security vote. So the political economy of conflict is what allows these conflicts to become entrenched and to become chronic and so forth. And so that's a critical element. It's an element in the explanation about the evolution of conflict, and it's an element in the explanation for why conflicts start as well, because of the patterns. The question about conflict management and early warning is critical. The overlapping forms of violence is a critical observation. And when I think about coding these 4,000 events, I can just tell you in a very practical sense, very few of these 4,000 events, if you read the reports on them, have a clear motivation, a clear set of antagonists that are fighting for one reason. Sometimes it's one party against another. Sometimes it's clearly Ife versus Modekeke for some particular land reason. But in most other cases, there can be bank robbery, there can be banditry of one sort or another, there can be different religious and or ethnic groups on different sides, chieftaincy, land disputes, sometimes all at once. If we think about the Miss World riots in 2002 in Kaduna, first it was over a religious insult. Then it morphed into attacks on shopping centers and properties belonging to certain politicians. Then it got back into conflicts between different ethno-religious communities. So was it a religious riot? Was it an ethnic riot? Was it a political riot? The answer is yes. It was all of the above, and it all took place in 5 days and went from back and forth. So there's a lot of variation, and that's critical. And
what do you do with the opposing?
And the idea of renegotiation is, I think, what Nigerians are talking about. And the idea of not only renegotiating people's connection to distribution through development, connection to political access through free and fair elections and representative parties and a reduction of party oligarchy, but also renegotiation of federalism and the way federalism really works. Then there's a question on the geography of conflict, and I would simply say to the person who raised that question that we are in, to quote Bernie Sanders if I can, we're in radical agreement. I think you nicely encapsulated exactly what I was hoping to get across. and we totally agree that political exclusion and perceptions of exclusion in certain forms explain the eruption of violence. And the gentleman from Borno who talked about state violence, I think again, we largely agree that that's a critical element. The one final thing I'll say, because this question came up earlier, is what about Nnamdi Kanu and Gani Adams and Zakzaki? Why are there no insurgencies coming out of those groups? There's been state violence, there are youth, they're anti-establishment, they feel excluded. And the argument there is that you have elites in those districts, in those segments, that are not willing to sponsor those groups and that are pursuing separate distribution and clientelism in those areas, and that have a part of the core pact and the core bargain, so there's not widespread popular. So it remains contained, it remains small. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, you know, why IPOB and OPC and the IMN have remained contained, but not Boko Haram and not MEND and so forth. And the argument here is that the elites lack the authority and the unity or the cohesion to play that stabilizing role.
Thank you. We'll take another set of 5 questions, but context, please. In the last 20 years, remember this is a conversation about escalating violence in the 20 years of democracy. In the last 20 years, the nation has spent trillions of dollars. Within the same last 20 years, some members of the elite have become billionaires across all the ethnic groups. And these are people who have held public office. Within the same last 20 years, all the major roads in this country, between 1999 and today, none of them has been fixed from one end to the other. Enugu to Port Harcourt has always had bad patches in the last 20 years. Enugu to Onitsha, if you're going from to go to Maiduguri, to Makodi and the rest of them, as in all major roads, and if you're going to Lagos from Kogi, that road where you practically pass people's backyards is still the way it is. Now, this is a nation that has blown billions of dollars within the period under review. Poverty has grown. The elite, everybody who is anybody has private security. And so you see that the disengagement of the people from the state is a factor. And I want us to interrogate the impact of this on national security and insurgency, and the growing ability of the elite to become rallying points for the, for the insurgents and disgruntled Nigerian youth. So we'll take 5 more questions.
Your particular situation, you talk so much about it, I want to dwell on it. You spoke about security sector reform. Now, I want to ask you, state police, do you think it can be part of that reform? Because even before now I talk about security sector reform, people just look at it from not from an in-depth analysis, but just security sector reform. In this particular instance, because the way the Nigerian police is now, it is almost impossible that they can contain the security challenge in this country. Do you think it is a way forward too? The early part Prof spoke about, I want to believe that our elite are selfish. They are not progressive like their counterparts elsewhere. Do you think that this caliber of elite we have today in Nigeria can bring anything good to security containment in this country and development? Thank you.
Thank you. Elite conspiracy that has converted the Nigerian state into a criminal enterprise. That will strengthen his question. Number 2.
Sir, I came late. I didn't get at the beginning of it, but I got the input of what you have said. I want to ask, given the occurrences of these, what we call insurgency and banditry, criminality, and so on and so forth, would it be right if we say that it is a pattern that's not peculiar to Nigeria. It's a pattern that is peculiar to virtually the entire African continent, to Southeast Asia, to Central America, and so forth within the third world countries. My question is, how come that we have so much of these insurgencies and criminalities and so on and so forth in these African countries, yet they are not in the developed world? How is it that we don't have this in the United States, we don't have this in Western Europe and so on? What is the explanation? Is there any nexus between the underdevelopment of these African countries and other parts of the world with these criminalities and its lack of it in the developed world?
Thank you.
If there's any explanation, I would want to please. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. You put the scenario which the other participants here, members here, talked about. And then when you look at it critically, would you not ask yourself, is Nigeria a failed state?
Is Nigeria what?
A failed state.
Okay.
Now, when you look at your various interventions, you ask yourself, are they not symptoms of the failed state? And if these are symptoms, you recall that you could easily define the failed state as a state where the government of the day have lost the monopoly of legitimate use of force or violence or coercion, if you like. And all these are present in Nigeria. And when you look at your presentation, don't you see that these are many symptoms? Should we interrogate this deeply by looking at, you mentioned negotiation. If we need to renegotiate this country because it's totally collapsed,
okay.
What are the parameters? How do we begin to look at the criminal conspiracy between the ruling elites, the multinational corporations, and the colonized colonial powers? And finally, don't you think some of the things you see reoccurring in Nigeria could be as a result of lack of peacefully negotiated settlement of the Nigerian Civil War? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the lady said, and I'm worried that the Nigerian state allows humanitarian service into Sambisa Forest to service Boko Haram. I'm surprised to hear this. If it is true, it's a failure of the Nigerian state, because Boko Haram itself has been declared a terrorist group. Are they entitled to humanitarian services? The law of war does not recognize insurgency, and so if Nigerian state allows flight into Sambisa Forest to provide whatever means, it's wrong, and it should be looked into. That's the first one. And secondly, to say that even countries, I served in Iran as a military observer, UN military observer, and Iran never, no nation ever allows any external affairs to go into any place without a liaison officer. A liaison officer must be in it. And so, if there's need for flight to go into any area, there must be a Nigerian representation in that place. And if the Nigerian state is not doing that, I'm sorry, it's very, very wrong, and it should be noted for correction. That's the first point I want to make.
That's the second. And you're running out of time. You've actually run out of time.
The last one, sir. The last one, sir. It's about the question of true federalism. And I want to put down this question. What is true federalism? Are we trying to be indigents of Nigeria or want to be citizens of Nigeria? If we want to be citizens of Nigeria, then we cannot be disaggregating ourselves. We must aggregate ourselves, and we can only aggregate ourselves by being citizens of Nigeria and not indigents of Nigeria. And for me, every argument about true federalism that says that people should go, the Yoruba man should run his own, and so on and so forth, is disaggregating the system. And there's no nation, I'm not aware of any nation that survives as indigents and not citizens. We should be citizens and not indigents. That's the
Thank you. Sorry? Let's have one more, please. Yes, please.
What I was out, general talk has always been about aliens, we are a crowd. Terrorism, no one has made reference to the nature of the economic system.
To the
nature of the economic system.
The underlying political economy,
Yes,
okay?
the underlying political economy. My question is, because he made reference to the conflict in Malaysia, the conflict in India, and gradually those conflicts are dying down. Don't you think that it's the nature of our political economy that is bringing about this high level of conflict? Because in the 80s, the conflict was not like it was there was oil money coming in. Right now, with the level of economic instability, the conflict has been escalating.
Thank you. Prof.
I think at a general level, and the earlier question about underdevelopment, can we be surprised that a country that's producing as much electricity as a small town in many other parts of the world, that lacks roads that go traverse regions like the Northeast or east to west, that has 60% male illiteracy and 85% or 80% female illiteracy in some parts of the country, that has serious deficits in the educational system, serious deficits in the health system. Are we surprised that there should be violence, that there should be pressures for rebellion or insurgency? At a general level, this is no surprise at all. These are facilitating conditions. I think, however, part of the premise of the study or part of the argument that I'm making is it's not a sufficient condition. It's an important background factor, and in many poor countries, but not all poor countries, you find high levels of violence and you find high levels of conflict. The question has become, is Nigeria distinctive? Should it be considered a failed state? My own perspective is not inclined in that direction, because there are parts of Nigeria's economy, infrastructure, human capital, and institutions that are fully functional. They're challenged, but they're functional. I think of Nigeria more in comparison to countries like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Mexico, Colombia, Pakistan. What do these countries have in common? When you go to the capital, when you go to the main commercial city, when you go to certain portions of the country, you find a functional economy, you find professionals, world-class professionals, you find a state that is governing the territory and providing some level of public goods. And yet they have segments of the country that are almost permanently out of reach of the central government because of insurgency and rebellion. So you don't have a fully functional, if you will, Weberian state that can control all of its territory, but you have large segments that are functional. And I think Nigeria is very much in that class of countries, where there are some functional areas and some areas that are highly dysfunctional. The question of the economic foundations is essential to the argument, because the elite pacts are around distribution and distributive politics. And the argument is that if you had broader economic access, if there were not regions that were obsessively focused for the last almost 50 years now, since 1970, obsessively focused, as they must be, on distribution from the federal distributable pool and the revenue allocation formula from the center, but you had viable local economies, as is forming in the Southwest today. If that was true in Jos and Kaduna, rather than deindustrialization, austerity, and poverty, much less in the Northeast, which is suffering not only the problems of austerity and just chronic underdevelopment, but also climate change and the shifts and disjunctures there. If people had economic access, the problem of inclusion would not be negotiated through political elites. The elites would have no interest in bargaining over delivering their region or their votes or securing some specialized access in the political system for their own purposes. So the argument is that if you had broader public goods, broader political access, you would have very much reduced violence. The question about citizenship is an important one, and it's not only Nigerian citizenship, but it's really state citizenship. But true federalism, as I understand it, or at least, and I'll be candid here, at least as I am sympathetic to some of the arguments I hear from Nigerians, says, look, federalism has too rigid a control from the center. The concurrent and separate list has to be renegotiated. You have to have governments that can build their own power sectors, their own education sectors, maybe their own policing sectors, their own tax systems, their own economic systems. Federalism works that way in some other countries, including the United States. And if there were more flexibility and more internal revenue generation, more flexibility in where to allocate resources, maybe build a power grid here, maybe bolster education there, you might get different results. The question of policing is critical to this. I see it as a domestic question, and I am going to be agnostic about it, but I'll simply lay out the two possible scenarios. In one good scenario, you get local policing that's connected to the community, speaks local languages, and has the political backing of governors and or communities to really eradicate banditry, insecurity, kidnapping, and to provide some surveillance and some intelligence and to really maintain order within the state. In a bad scenario, you get governors who are using the police as their private militias and who are terrorizing citizens and looking the other way when bandits and kidnappers are doing their business because of a political economy at the state level and worsening insecurity. I don't know the answer to that. I think there are good arguments for state policing, and if it worked well, it would be an important solution. But if it worked badly, it could mean some real disparities in terms of conflict. And I think that there was one last thing that I wanted to talk about just quickly. The question of the Civil War that was raised by the gentleman who talked about the failed state. You know, that was the sort of tipping point for Nigeria as a failed state. The country was unraveling. It was a deep civil war. At least 2 million people died. Many people would say more, but we'll settle on that horrific number for now. That was a tipping point, a breaking point in the consciousness of this country. And anybody who was 8 years old, 7 years old, who starved in Biafra, anybody who was fighting at that time, I mean, if you were a 20-year-old fighting in the Biafran army, you're scarcely 70 today. So the memories of that are still with us. And nobody wants to go back to that. And the notion that there can be a seamless, painless agreement, and Biafra will just separate, and Abuja will just let them go, and there won't be any complicated citizenship or economic issues, is just a pure fantasy. There are realities on the ground. So I don't think that, I think that the resolve, the lessons from Biafra, or the lessons from the Civil War, were to try and do serious, concerted, and quite sophisticated efforts to make federalism work, creating states, changing revenue allocation formulas, changing citizenship formulas. We can discuss what's improved and what needs still to be fixed. But that's the agenda, is how to keep the nation state together. The challenge for a democratic Nigeria is how to make a single nation state more inclusive so that you don't have large segments really falling out into mass violence.
Thank you. We'll take the last set of 5 questions. Well, let's thematize that. Let's thematize or problematize issues to be addressed. Remember, we're here discussing the fact that violence has gone up since the return of democracy, and that it's been going on consistently for the last 20 years. So I want us to wind down by looking at whether indeed there's a prospect of it not rising higher, given what we're doing today. And I'll call our attention to 2 or 3 things. Most state houses of assembly today are working on pensions for themselves, isn't it? Some already concluded that. And then for state governors, that was concluded for many years. Shomole was synonymous with labor and the people for a very long time. They were well structured swindle in my view, but it lasted long enough. He became governor. At the time of departure, the state assembly enacted a law for all past governors of the state on exit to be entitled to a house worth 200 million naira, and for the deputy governor 100 million. And when I heard about it, I said, well, probably he wants to set up a hotel for the whole of Africa. If you go to Lagos, in the case of Lagos and all the states, you're entitled to a certain amount in millions. You're entitled to 4 cars every 4 years. You're entitled to a driver, a gardener, a cook, other domestic staff. In fact, in the case of Lagos, I think you're also entitled to 100 million naira medical bill per annum, covering all your family. Now, what you see is that through the instrumentality of democracy, those elected to serve us are recreating what you might call an aristocracy of idlers who will feed on state funds. And so for the states in the next 15, 20 years, every month they must each pull out between 500 and 1 million to service people who already did very well for themselves in public office. Poverty will grow, marginalization will increase, and anybody aspiring to public office is looking at what he's going to walk away with, a life of idle enjoyment for himself and the rest of his family. And if you look around, all of us here are Nigerians. Please go to the political office holders you know and find out how their cousins, and I'm talking about members of the extended family, are doing. It's not going beyond the nuclear family and religion. Let us, in this concluded session, address the question of whether democracy going for the next 24 years is going to reduce the specter that has been brought before us by Professor Lewis.
I just asked whether in your analysis you have really examined the pattern of governance and administration, particularly in northern Nigeria. Who were those that are largely responsible for the functions of governance, conflict resolution, allocation of resources, and management of these resources? My understanding is that community institutions were very central in this management rather than public institutions. And the increasing weakening of these community institutions and the incursion of some of the state institutions in taking over some of the functions of those community institutions significantly led to a collapse in the effectiveness of governance, as well as the introduction of new corrupt practices, insensitivities, and inefficiencies that allowed a lot of what we see to grow to what it is. I don't know your comment on that. The second one is just for you to comment on the media and the challenges that we are seeing in Nigeria.
My name is Hassana Abdul Aduku. I thank Mr. Dr. Peter Lewis for your contribution, especially the analytical analysis. You know, so the problem we have in the country is inadequate data. And when data is inadequate, it affects policy making. And that is what you have done. Like you said, the problem is with government policy. The rural people are not connected. And once they are not connected and integrated, then there will be problems. Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel confident to engage us on ourselves here. Now, the issue is, my name is Nuhu Yakubu. The issue is about conceptual issues in relation to some of the problems that are facing us, particularly the theme of this discussion, which is violence and conflict in the Fourth Republic. Now, concepts like democracy has been used, very liberally in this discussion. I really want us to interrogate: do we actually have democracy in this Fourth Republic? Do we have it? And what is the substantive differentiation between what we are practicing now and what existed, no matter how underdeveloped it was during the First Republic, for instance? Because I realized that from my readings that in the First Republic, people, we had political parties, even though they were regionally based, but there were members actually own these parties, which is contrary to what is the situation at the moment, whereby the issue of Godfather, is the one that is actually shaping, driving, so-called politics we are playing at the moment. So I'm really worried whether there's democracy, in the real meaning of the word. In other words, that it is a government. If we use the Lincolnian definition, government of the people, by the people and for the people. Now, do Nigerians really have a stake in what is being practiced?
Thank you very much. Former Boko Haram theater commander, still a general, he has conveniently sneaked out with a note. Among other things on the note, he thought he should correct something. That there is no flight ever allowed into Sambisa Forest because there is no landing space, not stock yet. There has never been. 8 workers are not allowed into Sambisa. They will not even go if allowed because of the danger. That he has to leave. But that there are people, there are interests, if you like, servicing the insurgency. There are mercenaries, mostly from France. There are gun runners who fund a gun lobby in the US. This is a business. They need those factories running. And so they come to leverage some of what is going on. But as for flying in Education, he thought he should correct it. And then they could do it. So that was Prof. Who is the next one, number 4?
The coming of the 21st century saw the passion for faith. And if you look at the crisis in the country from 1999 to date, a sizable percentage of it is associated with religion or religious crisis. If you look at Nigerians, those in primary school, to those in secondary school, to the working class, to the elite, the politicians, each and every one of them belongs to a religious group. Now my question is, if all Nigerians are either Christians or Muslims or belong to any other religion, is it that the religious leaders are not doing enough to caution the minds or the brains or the thinking of those in position?
Thank you very much. Why the religion has no impact on the behavior of Nigeria? Okay, number 4 now.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Stanley Ijoma. I run a climate change consultancy. My question is, how big, do you think that the influence of environmental factors, specifically climate change, in driving violence and conflict for Nigeria, considering our three-dimensional exposure, in the north, desertification, drought, in the south, where you have accelerated sea level rise, coastal inundation and probably inland erosion. So you have displacement in the south, you have from the north, and that's why the middle belt of Nigeria has become a theater of conflict, mainly climate change induced conflict. Most of what the media calls herdsmen issue is actually a sizable percentage of that is caused by the displacement, from the north. Yeah. So we all know that Lake Chad has lost more than 90% of its water body, for instance. So you have millions of people displaced who hitherto before now were depending on that lake for their livelihood. So how big do you think that will be for Nigeria? Also looking at the absence of governance structure, climate change governance structure in Nigeria here. Thank you.
Like we actually must close by 6. It's always been the pattern of this dialogue.
Yes, please. Good evening, everybody. My name is Etikero Sora from African Community Bridge Foundation. My question is this: from the infograph you showed us, where you can see that there's a spike from 2011, it goes up. There are so many reasons that can happen, but one reason that comes to my mind is that's the same time communication became very easy in Nigeria. Technology came in so much. Everyone has a phone, everyone has a camera and all that. So it was easy for people to project what's going on. It was easy for people to actually tell people like, okay, this is what's happening. And at the same time, so many youths have access to this technology, which makes it easy for past people to actually influence them and mobilize them to do their bidding. So how can we actually work on this to demobilize them and actually make them look into the future for a safer future? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
1 minute.
Yeah, my deepest apologies. I came in very late, but there was something I wanted to hear, which was, whether Peter did situate our challenges, with McConaughey's theory about the roaming and stationary bandits. So my question is, without sort of being offensive to anybody, could you give me a philosophical approach, to how we can address the stationary and roaming bandits problem as you described in your book?
So you're saying it's an authority on banditry? Yes, please, bro.
Time is of the essence. So the first question was about, in northern Nigeria, governance, community institutions, and state institutions. With respect, I would say it's not simply a northern Nigerian observation. There are community institutions of governance in other parts of the country as well. They vary in their roots and their traditions. And it certainly is true that when state institutions fail or try to encroach but don't deliver, that people are led back to community institutions, and if those don't work either, then you're really in a dire situation. You're in a fluid situation where you can't rely on your social structure or your social institutions. You can't rely on the state, and that exacerbates marginalization. The second question and the last question really actually dovetail, interestingly. Thank you for the observation about data. I'm glad somebody noticed. It's useful to have some numbers, and of course we don't get them from the Nigerian state in any way, shape, or form, so we're doing our best. And we hope that people will critically interrogate the way we use and present data, and we'll make it better. But the question about rural people being marginalized and the question about roving and stationary bandits, which was a theory from Mansur Olson that I used in a previous book on Indonesia and Nigeria, very important because they speak to the question of when do you get incentives for an elite to pursue a developmental state? And when do you get incentives for an elite to simply pursue a predatory state? And this is the critical question facing Nigeria. There is no shortage of human capital and no shortage of good ideas about how to move the country forward. What policies, what investments, what areas of pressure or access would move the country forward. You educate women and girls, you build infrastructure, You have appropriate fiscal discipline and a minimum of a stable economy. You provide some basic public goods in critical areas. It's not a complicated formula, but it hasn't been done. And another perspective on this, which speaks to the roving and stationary bandit, which incidentally, that's a model that says some rulers say, I'm going to stabilize the country, there'll be some corruption, but I want to make the economy grow, and I'll get my 5% or my 10%. That's a stationary bandit, like a mafia situation, right? A roving bandit is you go into a neighborhood and you smash a window or hold somebody up, and you don't care what happens to that community because you're out of there. And the argument is that some people have acted as stationary bandits, but perhaps a better way of putting it is what Dan Slater more recently has written. He's a political scientist at University of Michigan, and Dan Slater has looked at Indonesia and Malaysia and some other countries in South and East Asia, which decades ago had serious civil wars or social violence of the type we're talking about. And at a certain point, 1969 in Malaysia, 1965, 66 in Indonesia, new governments came in and they said, the only way we're going to stabilize the country is to develop is to advance the economy and to provide development for the rural areas. Because this is where the communists are coming from, this is where the ethnic challenges are coming from. The problem there was communism. So if we're going to stabilize the country, we have to have distribution, we have to have poverty reduction, we have to have different ethnic groups. In Malaysia, you had Chinese, you had indigenous people, you had foreign capital. They all have to have a state. And that formula works. And the question is whether there could be a coalition here, whether there could be some kind of circumstantial tipping point, an existential threat that would galvanize the Nigerian political class and the Nigerian elite to say, look, the only way out of this is to pursue development. Start using the oil revenues for investment. Start providing public goods. Start mitigating, stemming corruption in politics and in the bureaucracy, and getting the growth rate above 5 or 6 or 7%. It can be done. Plenty of other countries have come from worse circumstances than we find today and have made rapid gains. It could start today, but it's a political problem and a political solution. Let me see if there's any last thing. The observation about the difference between the First Republic parties and the other parties is a conversation I've had with more than one person. It's a very astute observation, I think. I think those parties, they couldn't agree among themselves, and it ultimately brought down democracy. But within their regions, they did have more legitimacy and more connection to their constituencies. And finally, I'll just say the communications and youth critical element, and the environmental factors are a critical element, and obviously a huge driver. Every conflict I've mentioned as the central conflicts that we've talked about, herders and farmers in the land conflict, Plateau and Kaduna, Niger Delta, Northeast Nigeria, every one of those has the environment as an essential element. Not the only element, but an essential element in driving the conflict. But again, that's a background factor, and the question is, how do you respond to that? You respond by giving people livelihoods. And it's been done in China, it's been done in Indonesia, it's been done in Colombia, it's been done in other countries, and I continue to believe and expect that it will be done.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very quickly. There's just a point for which I thought we might just spend 30 seconds on about the question of democracy and godfatherism. Godfatherism is not new. Awo was a godfather, Ahmadu Bello was a godfather, but they performed the true role of godfather, which is to produce ideological disciples for a better society. What we have are predators who want to use the hand of somebody to collect something from the fire and eat. That's essentially the difference. I thought I should mention that so we don't overlook it. Over to you, Louis.
I think today has been really engaging. And as a public sector consulting firm, one of our major dreams is to make sure that we create a society we all want to live in. And I think this is the essence of this thing we are doing here. Let me equally apologize for the parking space. We try to provide security to help out there. I'm sure after today my team will find a way around it. I'm not promising we're going to solve it all, but we'll find a way to get it. And yes, change of location. At least I'm sure someone will give me a call to this evening to know how we're going to solve it. And once again, I'm thanking everybody for coming and for engaging. And let us make sure we all drop maybe our email addresses, because in a day or two, the position paper from this course will be going out, as well as the 23-page paper from Professor Lewis. Once you have your email, we'll be sending them out. And as well as we have a daily mail, a weekly email, and a monthly publication. I think it would be good if you drop your email with us. And thank you all for coming.